Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is the defense of poetry. And really, I've just kind of picked out a couple of key points here, a couple of key quotes. So take your time and read through it. Look at all the various different angles that he says. But essentially, this is his nice condensed philosophy of poetry. This is what poetry is about, according to Percy Bysshe Shelley. And this is interesting because I think this is where we can really see those two sides of Shelley, those two different notions. So if you go on to the third slide, I have a quote here, the quote from Matthew Arnold that I mentioned before, who has described Shelley as, and I quote here, a beautiful and ineffectual angel, beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. And that is from 1888. So that is an interesting notion of Shelley, beautiful but ineffectual, an angel, this kind of something beyond human, so incredibly lovely, these luminous wings, but beating his wings in vain, never achieving anything, never really doing anything, just there, lovely, a vision of light and beauty. And that, I think, we'll see why that comes up as we look at both defense and at some of the poetry, and then the countryside of that, read Shelley. And if you're interested in kind of the more political side of Shelley, if you look at the next slide, I would recommend this book, Read Shelley by Paul Foote. Probably going to come back to this quote in a second, but essentially Shelley has kind of subsequently been hailed by Marxists. We have a nice quote here by Eleanor Marx, and then another one from kind of Paul Foote there, just sort of saying, no, he is a political radical. His ideas are kind of beyond their time. His ideas are innovative. They're very, I mean, we can look at them now and see they're very feminist, they're very progressive, they're very kind of, communist. It is about let's break down, let's take the wealth away from those at the top and spread it out amongst those who need it, spread it out amongst everyone. And the poet's role in that is interesting. So come on to our next slide and you'll have one of the most famous quotes from the defense of poetry. I've just given an entire slide to itself because it's an absolute banger. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. What does that mean? Okay, what is a legislator? Somebody who makes legislation, somebody who says how things ought to be. So Shelley here is saying that poets shape the world. And this is an interesting idea, and I think today we could take that idea of poets and broaden it out to just be kind of creatives, to think of, filmmakers and authors and artists, musicians, all kinds. The people who make what we consume shape our society, and this is why people criticize works that don't have good representation. We go, hang on, you're making this, saying this is what society is. Shelley is saying the ideas that poets put out there shape the way people live their lives. So in that that's a really very kind of political statement in a lot of ways. What should we write about? If we look at the impulses of a lot of nature poetry, we might say it's just beautiful, just enjoying nature, just saying, oh, it is a lovely day, I can hear the birds singing, there is green outside my window, these are lovely things. Okay, sure, that is the whole purpose, but even with looking at, look at Wordsworth, he's not just saying that, he's not just saying this is lovely, he's saying something very particular about it, and by enjoying the natural world, you are participating in that. Now, moving on to the next slide, Shelley touches on kind of an idea of the poet as prophet, the poet as a sort of privileged place in society, for he not only beholds intensely the present as it is, he being the poet here, and discovers those laws according to which present things ought to be ordered, but he beholds the future in the present. So one, he has a clear vision. He can see what is happening right now. He's not kind of just blinded by circumstance. And he sees how things should be. he discovers those laws according to which present things ought to be ordered. So that the poet here isn't just, whoever picks up a pen can be a poet. It's saying, no, that the poet is somebody who is imbued with a special intelligence that is perceptive, that is keen. And this person has the power to see how things should be. Not just both how things are, but not just how things are. How things are and how they should be. He beholds the future and the present. Again, that is a kind of perceptiveness saying, yes, he can look at it. He can look at what we have now and see what the likely outcome will be, which is a separate thing from saying how things ought to be. So there's a kind of duality there. And a warning here, so the quote below, a very nice one, poet therefore would do ill to embody his own conceptions of right and wrong, which are usually those of his place and time, in his poetical creations, which participate in neither. So he's saying, well, we have to be careful with our own opinions because those are shaped by our place and time. Those are shaped by where we come from. But poetical works exist longer than that. They travel. They travel in ways that people don't. Percy Shelley is someone who lived in England and Italy for most of his life, and he died 200 years ago, and yet his works are living on. His works are reaching so much further than he ever could. Absolutely all kinds of places all over the world, and this vast amount of time. So he was aware of that. He was very aware of the role that the poet had and felt a duty to do the right thing, to say something useful. I think have a look at the next quote is about kind of man being like a lyre. Have a read through that in your own time. The idea is that the wind blows through the lyre, and it just makes a sound. So there's some pictures of it on the next couple of pages of just, it is an instrument that doesn't need a player, and he's kind of saying man is like an instrument that doesn't need a player. Circumstance happens and he responds accordingly. The idea of the veil is lovely. So go on, you'll see the slide with all the pictures of the harps on them. Some really, really cool ones. Go on to the next one. And we come to this idea of the veil, which Shelley uses a lot. And the veil is connected with appearance and reality. So he often talks about there being a veil over the world that is hiding a truth, that we have some kind of true form deep within us, and the veil is what is our external appearances. It's what people can see of us and what people understand of us from the outside. Here we have a lovely quote. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects as if they were not familiar. It reproduces all that it represents. If any of you kind of remember from critical theory, a lot of the Russian formalists talk about defamiliarization, that what literature does is it takes what is familiar and makes it unfamiliar. This concept called otrajny is the word in kind of literary criticism. So he's kind of saying, what part of poetry is that we have this person who perceives the world differently from other people, and the purpose of poetry is that he puts that form of vision into poetry so that people who have seen the same thing over and over read the poem, perceive it differently, and understand what is beneath it. And so sometimes, for Shelley, that is talking about kind of the power of nature. But sometimes that is, well, let's look at a political background to something. How did we come to be in this place? Let's talk about the governments that are manipulating the wheels that are turning. Don't just look at the thing that exists, but what has made it happen? What is the context around it? And so at the same time as he's saying things like this of, a real purpose of the poet, he has these phrases which are very beautiful and often quoted, but where we can really see the idea of him being this lovely angel. The poet is the nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer its own solitude with sweet sounds. His auditors are as men entranced by the melody of an unseen musician, who feel that they are moved and softened, yet know not whence or why. The poet sits in solitude and sings to cheer itself. Well, that sounds like a very pretty, indulgent thing, and the people who listen to this bird's song, i.e. the people who read this poem, are they don't really know who the poet is and where they are. They're detached from the poet. And this is what kind of leads to people like Arnold saying, oh, he's just this ethereal creature. The notion of the veil, the notion of seeing and unseeing, kind of connects us, really leads us into the painted veil, which I think I'll be the last one I'll look at on this video, and then we'll get on to some of the really good political stuff. The painted veil, which is a phrase that you've probably kind of heard all over the place. I'm gonna read it through. Take your time. So then the next slide has the full poem quoted there, but do kind of read it through and make notes on your own copy. Lift not the painted veil which those who live call life, though unreal shapes be pictured there, and it but mimic all we would believe with colours idly spread. Behind lurk fear and hope, twin destinies, whoever weave their shadows o'er the chasm, sightless and drear. I knew one who had lifted it. He sought, for his lost heart was tender, things to love, but found them not, alas. Nor was there aught the world contains the which he could approve. Through the unheeding many he did move, a splendour among shadows, a bright blot upon this gloomy scene, a spirit that strove for truth, and like the preacher found it not. So this is, it sounds so absolutely heavenly, I think. The painted veil, so this idea of the things, I've put below an illustration on if you go on to the next slide, there's an illustration of Plato's cave, which he's really drawing on this idea of the truth of things behind and the image beforehand. I imagine you probably, a significant number of you come across Plato's cave before, but the idea is that there are people watching, there are these prisoners who are watching, are bound to this one spot, and they are watching the shadows on the wall, and they've never seen anything other than the shadows on the wall. There's a play being acted out. This is in front of a fire. Fire is behind them. Then there's the prisoners. They are watching the shadows on the wall. They've never seen anything other than the shadows, so they believe the shadows are all there are. In truth, the shadows are just reflections of what's happening behind, obviously. And that was a kind of an idea that we see the world, and the world we see is only shadows. Like, we're not actually getting at the real thing when we see sort of physical appearances